September 1943, 6,000 feet above the Huon Gulf, a lone P-38 Lightning snaps into a steep bank and vanishes into a towering thunderhead as 6 Japanese Zeros tighten in pursuit. The pilot is only 22 years old. His fellow pilots consider him green. His commanding officer has already written him up twice for ignoring established procedure. Now he is attempting a maneuver that should not even be possible. A turn so severe, so implausible for a twin-engine fighter, that enemy pilots will assume something has broken. They will not understand their mistake until it is far too late. New Guinea in 1943 is not a conventional battlefield. It is a delirious landscape wrapped in jungle and rain. The smell of aviation fuel mixes with rotting vegetation. Mosquitoes gather in clouds dense enough to smear instrument glass. Pilots sleep in tents that fill with water during monsoons, attend briefings under sagging tarps, and fly missions over an island that has already killed more men through disease than gunfire. The 5th Air Force operates from crude airstrips hacked out of kunai grass, Marston matting thrown down over sucking mud. Ground crews work barefoot because boots disintegrate in days. Mechanics cannibalize wrecked aircraft because supply lines move slower than the war itself. Every sortie is a wager against weather, range, and an enemy who knows the terrain intimately. Japanese fighters control the northern approaches, Zeros and Oscars flown by veterans of China and the Philippines. Men who learned air combat while most American pilots were still teenagers. They are lighter, more agile, able to turn inside any Allied aircraft. American doctrine is explicit: never dogfight a Zero. Rely on speed and altitude. Boom and zoom, dive, fire, climb away, repeat. It is sensible advice, logical, rooted in physics and survival data. For most pilots, it works. But doctrine assumes every aircraft behaves exactly as designed. It assumes pilots obey the manual. It does not account for farm boys who learn to extract more from machines than engineers ever planned. The P-38 Lightning is a paradox. Twin engine, twin boom, heavy yet fast. It can outrun almost anything at altitude and deliver brutal firepower from its nose-mounted guns. But it is not meant to turn. The manual says so. Training officers say so. Combat veterans say so. It turns like a freight car, sheds energy in hard banks, and if forced into a tight turn at low speed, it will snap into a fatal spin before recovery is possible. So the guidance is straightforward: stay fast, stay high, use range and firepower, never try to turn with the enemy. It is good advice, and nearly everyone follows it, almost. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. His name was Richard Ira Bong. He was born on December 24, 1920, in Superior, Wisconsin, the third of 9 children. His father was a Swedish immigrant who farmed in fixed machinery with wire, patience, and intuition. His mother was a schoolteacher. The family lived on flat land where winter arrived early and stayed late, or equipment either worked or you made it work because help was not coming. Bong grew up with his arms buried in tractor engines. He learned early that manuals were suggestions, not commandments. Machines had habits, not absolute limits. You learned their balance, their moods, the thin line where performance lived just before failure. He flew his first airplane at 18, a friend's light trainer, and immediately recognized the same principles: weight, thrust, pressure, timing. It was just another machine, and every machine could give more if you understood it well enough. He enlisted in May 1941, before America entered the war, but after its direction was unmistakable. Flight training followed at places with names like Thunderbird Field and Luke. He was quiet, courteous, and unremarkable in most categories. Instructors noted solid reflexes and competent gunnery. Nothing exceptional. No warnings. He graduated and earned his wings in January 1942, 1 month after Pearl Harbor. Then problems began, not from arrogance or rebellion, but from curiosity. He buzzed a friend's house in California and was reprimanded. He barrel-rolled over the Golden Gate Bridge and earned another. Superiors labeled him reckless. He disagreed. He believed he was probing limits, discovering what the aircraft could endure and where the real margins lay. Every stunt taught him something the manual never mentioned: how the P-38 felt just before a stall, how much rudder it took to whip the nose around, how propeller torque changed with throttle and angle. It was not showing off, it was experimentation. The Army Air Forces did not agree. They sent him to the Pacific in September 1942, assigned to the 49th Fighter Group in New Guinea, the place where young pilots learned fast or died. His squadron mates were older, hardened survivors of the Philippines retreat and Java. They regarded Bong with reserved doubt, a kid from Wisconsin who had buzzed bridges and never seen combat. Sometimes they called him farm boy to his face, not cruelly, just descriptively. He spoke little, avoided heavy drinking or gambling, spent off hours riding home or walking the airstrip watching mechanics work. He was pleasant enough, but expectations were low. His first victories came in December 1942, 2 zeros during a bomber escort. Clean engagements, strictly by the book. Boom and zoom. The squadron congratulated him. Routine success. Then in January, during a low-level sweep, something shifted. A zero latched onto his tail during a strafing run. Bong should have added power, extended, and escaped. Instead, he hauled into a climbing turn, tighter than the manual allowed, tighter than training endorsed. The P-38 trembled, shuddering at the edge of a stall. The zero followed, confident. Then bang rolled out, snap turning with rudder and uneven throttle, and the zero streaked across his nose. 3 seconds of gunfire, and the enemy aircraft came apart. It was instinct, intuition, or farm-bred logic applied at 4,000 feet. His wingman called it luck. Bang said nothing, but he remembered. It had worked, which meant it could work again. By mid-1943, the air war over New Guinea had turned into an equation no one could fully solve. American bombers needed escorts to survive. Japanese interceptors needed to crack those escorts to kill the bombers. Both sides understood the math. The side with better fighters, smarter tactics, or more fortune would win. The zero remained the wild card. Mitsubishi's S-6M was a minimalist triumph. Light, agile, flown by pilots trained in harsh, unforgiving programs. In a turning fight, a zero could outmaneuver anything the Americans had: P-40s, P-39s, even the new P-38s. Physics was unforgiving. A lighter aircraft with lower wing loading turned tighter. End of discussion. As a result, American doctrine hardened. Never dogfight. Use altitude, speed, coordination. Dive on the enemy, fire, climb back to safety, repeat. It usually worked, but it meant surrendering the vertical fight, surrendering slow-speed maneuvering, surrendering any situation where you could not dictate the engagement. It meant flying cautiously. It meant that whenever bombers were ambushed low, escorts scattered, or weather forced everyone down into the jungle airspace, American pilots died. Commanders knew it. Intelligence knew it. Everyone knew it. The solution was obvious: build a lighter fighter, train pilots longer, or overwhelm the enemy with numbers. But lighter fighters were years away. Training took time the war did not allow, and numbers mattered little when a handful of zeros could tie up dozens of P-38s by forcing defensive turns. Meanwhile, pilots kept dying. Not spectacularly, just steadily. One fighter lost here, two there, parachutes drifting into jungle where rescue never arrived. Empty cots in tents. Letters home written by surviving squadron mates. Statistically, the losses were acceptable. The air forces could replace pilots faster than they fell. But acceptable losses were not victory, and the men dying understood that distinction. Bong was one of them, flying mission after mission through that summer. By August, he had 12 confirmed kills, enough to make him a double ace, enough to earn respect. But respect did not alter doctrine, and doctrine still insisted the P-38 could not dogfight. He did not argue or file reports or challenge briefings, but he continued testing. On every mission, in every engagement, he edged closer to the boundary: tighter turns, slower airspeeds, steeper climbs. He discovered the P-38 had a peculiarity: a narrow window of speed and power where it could do things it was never supposed to do. If the throttles were kept uneven, the rudder used aggressively, and the stall buffet ridden without crossing it, the big twin-engine fighter could whip around almost as fast as a single-engine plane. Not quite as tight as a zero, but close enough that angles and geometry mattered more than pure turn radius. He told no one. There was nothing to report yet, only a hypothesis, a sensation, the kind of knowledge stored in hands and spine rather than words. He needed proof, and proof required circumstances doctrine warned you to avoid at all costs. September 12, 1943. Morning briefing in a tent heavy with mildew and cigarette smoke. The target was a Japanese airfield near WWII. Bombers would crater the runway and revetments. Fighters would escort and sweep. Routine mission. Expect heavy resistance. Zeros and Oscars nearby. Fly smart. Fly fast. Stay together. Bong sat toward the rear, barely paying attention. He had flown this plan dozens of times. The variables rarely changed: altitude, heading, fuel, radio channels. The rest revealed itself in the air. Takeoff at 0800. 16 P-38s forming over the coast, climbing through haze toward the bombers. The weather was typical: broken clouds, scattered rain, visibility shifting by the minute. The kind of sky where a wingman could vanish if you looked away. They rendezvoused with the bombers over the Gulf. B-25s, low and heavy, formations tight. Fighters fanned out into escort positions: high cover, low cover, flank guard. Bong flew mid-level, scanning the horizon. The coastline drew near: green jungle, white beaches, rivers flashing inland. Beautiful and lethal. Somewhere below, spotters were already calling ahead. The zeros rose fast, climbing out of low clouds like sharks from deep water. 15, maybe 20. They ignored the bombers at first and went straight for the fighters. Textbook tactics: shatter the escort, then devour the bombers. The radio exploded with calls, contacts, headings, altitudes, the neat Formations dissolved into chaos. Bong rolled toward the nearest fight. 2 Zeros chasing a P-38 in a shallow dive. He dropped in behind, lined up the trailing Zero fired. Pieces flew off the wing route. The Zero snap rolled and dove away trailing smoke. Bong didn't follow, already scanning for the next threat. That's when he saw them. 6 Zeros slightly below, turning toward a pair of P-38s that had drifted south. The Americans hadn't seen them yet. Bong pushed the throttles forward and dove. His wingman called something over the radio. Bong didn't respond. No time. He closed to 1,000 yards. The Zeros spotted him and broke. 4 went defensive, turning hard to meet him. Heedon 2 continued after the P-38s. Bong fired at the nearest Zero, but missed. The Japanese pilots were good. They split vertically, 2 climbing, 2 diving, forcing Bong to choose. He pulled up after the climbers. His airspeed dropped. The P-38 felt heavy, mushy. He fired again. No hits. The Zeros rolled over the top and came back down at him from opposite sides. This was where doctrine said to dive away, use speed, reset. But the 2 P-38s were still in danger below, and the 4 Zeros were already repositioning. If Bong ran, 6 enemy fighters would regroup and someone would die. So he did the thing the manual forbade. He pulled into a max performance turn, not a gentle bank, a hard-wrenching haul on the yoke, full rudder, throttle staggered, nose high. The airframe groaned. The stall warning buffeted the controls. The P-38 seemed to pivot on its center of gravity, swapping energy for angle, bleeding speed for geometry. The first Zero shot past, 2 committed to adjust. The second tried to tighten his turn. Bong snap rolled, reversed, and pulled again. The world spun. Sky, clouds, jungle, sea. His vision tunneled. The force pressed him into the seat. He eased off just enough to stay conscious, then pulled again, and suddenly he was inside their turn, not behind, but inside. The Zeros had followed him into the spiral, confident in their advantage. But Bong had turned tighter than physics said a P-38 could turn. He'd sacrificed speed, altitude, safety margin. He'd flown right to the edge of a stall and held it there. And now 6 Japanese fighters were locked in a rotating fight with nowhere to go but through his guns. The first Zero never saw it coming. Bong rolled level just long enough to put the gun sight on target. The P-38's nose-mounted weapons. For 50 caliber machine guns and 120 mm cannon fired as a single mass volley. No convergence issues, no wing-mounted spread, just a concentrated stream of destruction. The Zero's canopy shattered. Fire bloomed from the engine. The fighter rolled inverted and fell away. The other 5 tried to scatter, but they were too slow, too close, trapped by their own commitment to the turn. Bong adjusted rudder, pushed throttle, pulled again. The P-38 responded like a machine possessed, shuddering, groaning, but turning, staying inside the radius, denying geometry. The second Zero climbed, trying to gain separation. Bong pulled lead, fired, walked the tracers into the fuselage. The tail section came apart. The Zero spun into clouds. Now the remaining 4 understood. They broke in different directions. 2 rolled out in dove for speed. Bong let them go. The other 2 tried to reverse back into him, a desperate countermaneuver. Textbook aggression, but Bong had already anticipated. He snap-rolled using differential throttle. Left engine high, right engine low, and the P-38 rotated faster than any twin-engine fighter should. He came out nose-on to the third Zero at 300 yards. Both pilots fired. Tracers crossed midair. Bong's rounds hit first. The Zero's propeller exploded into shrapnel. The fighter nosed over and dropped. The fourth Zero pilot broke hard left, then right, then rolled into a split S toward the jungle. A good escape. Bong followed, easing the P-38 into the dive. The airspeed built. 300 knots, 350. The controls stiffened. He fired a long burst, more suppression, then aimed. The Zero jinked, hit treetops, and cartwheeled into green. 4 down, 2 running. Bong pulled out of the dive at 2,000 feet, his arms ached. Sweat soaked his flight suit. The engine temps were redlined. The airframe had stress-wrinkled panels, but the P-38 was still flying. He keyed the radio and called clear. His wingman responded, disbelief edging his voice. He'd watched the whole thing. He didn't understand what he'd seen, neither did the 2 P-38 pilots Bong had saved. They rejoined him on the way back to base, waggling wings. In thanks, Bong just nodded, though they couldn't see him. He ran through the fight mentally, cataloging what worked and what almost didn't. The turn had been tighter than before, maybe too tight. He'd felt the airframe flex, felt the edge of departure. A few knots slower and he'd have spun. A little more G and he'd have blacked out, but it had worked. The flight back was uneventful. The bombers had hit their targets. A few more fights had broken out, scattered and inconclusive. By the time the formation crossed back over the Gulf, the sky was empty and the weather was closing in again. They landed in rain, the P-38s aquaplaning on the steel mat, ground crews rushing out to chalk wheels and inspect damage. Bong's aircraft was battered, stress cracks in the wing roots, oil streaking from one engine, panel fasteners sheared. The crew chief walked around it twice, silent, then looked up at Bong climbing down from the cockpit. He asked what happened. Bong said he turned hard. The crew chief said, "No kidding," and made a note to pull the wings for inspection. Debriefing was held in the operations tent. Bong reported 4 confirmed kills, maybe 5. The intelligence officer asked for details. Bong described the engagement in flat factual terms: altitude, heading, sequence of events. He didn't mention the turn, didn't describe the technique, just said he maneuvered and fired. The officer wrote it down. Another successful mission, another few zeros that wouldn't threaten bombers again. But Bong's wingman told a different story. He described the turning fight, the impossible spiral, the way Bong had outmaneuvered 6 enemy fighters in a plane that wasn't supposed to dogfight. Other pilots listened, skeptical. A P-38 couldn't turn like that. Everyone knew it. The wingman insisted he'd seen it, watched the whole thing. The squadron commander asked Bong directly, was it true? Had he really outturned zeros in a lightning? Bong hesitated. Then he said yes. The commander frowned. He asked, how? Bong tried to explain. Throttle management, rudder coordination, flying on the edge of stall. The words came out clumsy. It wasn't something you could convey in a briefing tent. It was something you felt through the stick and rudder pedals, learned across hours of testing, refined through instinct. The commander didn't understand. He told Bong to be careful, told him not to get cocky, told him that doctrine existed for good reasons, and breaking it got pilots killed. Bong said, yes, sir, and left the tent. He didn't argue. There was no point. They'd believe him or they wouldn't. The only proof was survival, and the only test was the next mission. 2 days later, every P-38 pilot in the squadron wanted to know how Bong had done it. Not officially. No formal request went up the chain, but in the tents at night during pre-flight checks, in the mess line, pilots asked. Bong tried to explain. He demonstrated with his hands, miming throttle and stick movements. Some pilots nodded and said they'd try it. Others shook their heads and said it sounded like suicide. Within a week, 3 other pilots reported successfully using the technique in combat. Tighter turns than they'd thought possible, defensive maneuvers that broke enemy attacks. One pilot used it to reverse a pursuit and scored a kill. Another used it to evade 2 zeros and escape. None of them pushed it as far as Bang had, but the principle was proven. The P-38 could dogfight. Not easily, not safely, but possible. Word spread. Other squadrons heard about it. Pilots compared notes. Maintenance crews noticed the increased stress on airframes, the cracked panels, and strained fittings. They reinforced where they could and warned pilots about limits. The technique had a price. Every hard turn aged the aircraft. Every buffet and shutter wore metal. But in exchange, pilots gained an option they hadn't had before. A way to survive when speed and altitude weren't available. A way to fight back. By November, tactical briefings began to change. Not the official doctrine. That stayed the same, but the informal guidance, the advice, passed from flight leaders to new pilots. They still said avoid turning fights when possible, still said use speed and altitude, but now they added a caveat. If you have no choice, if you're slow and low and the enemy is on you, the lightning can turn harder than you think. Here's how. Bong flew 20 more missions that fall. his kill count climbed. 15-20-25. By December, he was the top-scoring American ace in the Pacific. Reporters wrote about him. Newsreels featured him, the farm boy from Wisconsin who shot down Zeros like clay pigeons. The stories didn't mention the technique, didn't explain the turns or the throttle work. They focused on the score, the tally, the simple narrative of American ingenuity beating Japanese aggression. But the pilots knew, the mechanics knew, the men who flew and fought and survived. Because of what Bong had figured out, they didn't call him Farm Boy anymore. They called him Dick or Major Bang after his promotion. Some just called him the best. He stayed humble, wrote letters home to his parents and his girlfriend, Marge, talked about the weather and the food and how much he missed Wisconsin. Didn't talk much about combat. In photos from that time, he looks young and tired. Thin face, dark eyes, a half smile that doesn't quite reach all the way. The look of someone who's seen too much, but hasn't figured out how to carry it yet. The ripple didn't stop at New Guinea. Pilots rotated back to the States for leave or training assignments. They brought the technique with them, told other pilots, demonstrated in practice flights. Flight instructors tested it and added it to advanced training curricula, not as official doctrine, but as field-tested reality. The P-38's reputation began to shift. It was still a boom and zoom fighter, still best used with speed and altitude, but now it had depth, flexibility, a backup option when the mission went sideways. Combat loss rates. 4 P-38 squadrons dropped measurably in early 1944. Not dramatically. The air war was still brutal and unforgiving, but the margins shifted. Pilots survived encounters they wouldn't have before, came home when they should have died. The statistics were bloodless, a few percentage points, but behind every percentage point was a man who walked away, a letter that didn't have to be written, a family that stayed whole. No one attributed it directly to Bong's technique. War is far too chaotic for neat cause and effect. Survival was shaped by dozens of variables: training, experience, coordination, chance. But the technique mattered. It was part of the equation. One more instrument available. One more reason to trust that the Lightning could compete. The war ended, and Bang returned home. 40 victories. The highest scoring American ace of the Second World War. Decorations, parades, headlines. He married Marge in February 1945. They settled in California, where he accepted a position as a test pilot for Lockheed. He flew the new jets, the P-80 Shooting Stars, sleek, fast, temperamental machines that represented the future of flight. On August 6, 1945, the same day the Enola Gay released the atomic bomb over Hiroshima, Bong took off on what should have been a routine test mission. The P-80's engine failed during takeoff. He attempted recovery and failed, ejected too late. The parachute never opened. He was killed on impact. He was 24 years old. The nation grieved. President Truman sent condolences. Newspapers published tributes. The Air Force named a base after him in Wisconsin. But among the pilots who had flown beside him, who had learned from him, who had lived because of what he had discovered, the morning was quiet and deeply personal. They had lost the man who proved that boundaries could be pushed. Years later, aviation historians examined his combat reports. They dissected his victories, his methods, the way he forced a heavy fighter into angles it was never meant to achieve. Some called it brilliance, others called it instinct. A few dismissed it as luck. All of them were partly right and partly wrong. What Bong achieved was not a single moment of inspiration. It was the accumulation of countless small insights, a farm boy's understanding of machines combined with the nerve to test ideas when failure meant death. The P-38 remained in service until the war's end. It flew reconnaissance over Europe, attacked ground targets in the Pacific, and escorted bombers at ranges no other fighter could match. Pilots continued using the maneuver Bong had pioneered, refining it, teaching it, passing it along. The Lightning's reputation evolved. Not the ultimate dogfighter, not the fastest or lightest, but durable, flexible, and capable of more than its handbook suggested. When the war was over, most P-38s were scrapped or sold. A few found homes in museums. Visitors walk past them today, read the plaques, admire the twin booms and the clustered nose guns. The displays list speed, range, and firepower. They mention Bong's 40 kills. They do not describe the turn. They do not explain throttle asymmetry or rudder work. They cannot convey the instant when a farm boy from Wisconsin looked at a problem everyone else accepted and solved it anyway. Still,
The lesson remains embedded in the airframe, in after-action reports, in survival figures that shifted just enough to count. The lesson that mastery is not always written in manuals, that bravery can appear as curiosity,
that the narrow space between what a machine is designed to do and what it can actually do is often where survival lives.
Bond never wrote a memoir, never granted interviews explaining his method.
He never considered himself an innovator, only a pilot doing his job, trying to come home, helping others do the same. The same farm boy logic that made him exceptional also kept him modest. You don't brag about fixing a tractor, you just fix it. His legacy is not the victories or the medals or the records. It is the understanding that limits are more elastic than they appear, that institutions can be mistaken, and that a young man with grease under his nails and an open mind can see what experts miss. That reason and courage together can bend history, one impossible turn at a time. Somewhere over the Pacific, where ocean meets sky, the memory of that September morning endures, 6 zeros closing fast, a P-38 pulling harder than physics should allow.
A moment when everything that should not have worked, did.